Well, thank you very much, Marv. I'm delighted that you've invited me to speak here this morning. The work of the partnership is extremely important for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is that for many people, the work you do and the kinds of issues you address are really a matter of life and death. Making sure that our citizens have available safe medicines is not just good for business, which of course it is a global public health issue of the highest level, which affects large numbers of people in this country and indeed throughout the world. Moreover, it's a moral obligation that falls on all of us, companies, governments, and civil society, to address this issue of growing importance to so many people and our own country and abroad. Everyone in this room has at one point or another been in need of medication, and many on a regular basis take vitamin supplements. So the fact is that this is an issue that we all need to address from a personal as well as from a professional point of view. With this in mind, and particularly with the urgency of addressing this issue in mind, I would like to talk about three areas that I consider to be extremely important in the fight against counterfeit and substandard medicines. And those three are in the following three categories: collaboration, China, and confidence. On the issue of collaboration, I'm really delighted that I follow my friend and colleague, Peggy Hamburg, who addressed this group last year. I think in a way that illustrates the fact that because we're sort of back-to-back and speaking to this group, it's symbolic of the fact that we have also been working very closely together on a wide range of very important issues. And the collaboration between the FDA and the State Department on dealing with global pharmaceutical issues, issues of counterfeit medicine and substandard medicine, is one of the very important aspects of collaboration. To halt the spread of counterfeit and substandard medicines, we need this kind of collaboration across all agencies of the federal government, as well as among governments throughout the world, and I'll get to that in a moment, and with the private sector, and indeed with all stakeholder groups. The State Department, for instance, is funding a number of government-to-government anti-counterfeit medicines programs. The goal here is to help foreign law enforcement, customs officials, prosecutors, and judges to catch and convict criminals involved in counterfeiting medicines. While this funding is part of our intellectual property rights, or IPR, crime training and technical assistance package, I want to stress that the issue of counterfeit medicines is first and foremost a serious public health threat. And the public health threat has been illustrated in the panel I just witnessed before I was called to speak, just coming in before lunch. I think there's a great awareness of the nature of this public health threat. The question is how to combat it, how to address it. Criminals in pursuit of easy medicine place the lives of ordinary citizens in danger by selling drugs that are in the best case scenario, ineffective, or in the worst case scenario, fatal. One legal mechanism that we can use to catch these counterfeiters is enforcement of intellectual property rights. Capacity building and technical assistance training is delivered by the U.S. government's interagency teams composed of enforcement officials from the Department of Justice, from the Patent and Trademark Office, the Department of Homeland Security, and other agencies. U.S. private sector business and American civil society stakeholders, experts, have also been invited to participate in a large number of these programs. Last year, for example, and just as this is one example among many, we funded a very substantial program in Guatemala, and that exemplifies the kind of collaboration that we have exhibited and the kind of collaboration we need. There in Guatemala, for instance, the State Department and the Department of Justice hosted a 2-day workshop on combating counterfeit medications. Participants included the government of Guatemala's prosecutors, its judges, and its health officials. The Association of International Pharmaceutical Manufacturers, known as FEDAPharma, also participated in the workshop. The Department of Justice of the United States led a discussion on the practical problems encountered in investigating and prosecuting counterfeit medications cases and developing strategies to overcome these challenges. This program was very well received, and opportunities to replicate it are under review in other countries in other parts of the world. In addition to enforcement-focused activities, we are also collaborating with stakeholders to increase global awareness of the problem of counterfeit medicines through embassy-managed outreach programs. These public diplomacy projects rely on the involvement of health industry stakeholders, including educators, pharmacists, hospitals, industry associations, and foreign government officials. Counterfeiters rely largely on the ignorance of the public about the extent of counterfeiting and the techniques used to market counterfeit drugs in order to create the kind of market in which they thrive. So education is a critical element in countering the kinds of activities in which they're engaged. Our outreach projects bring together stakeholders from many areas in order to draw attention to the risks of counterfeit and substandard medicine, and to make it harder for counterfeiters to sell their illicit wares. We're also working very closely with the FDA to bring foreign drug regulators to the United States to receive training on drug quality control, on monitoring, and on counterfeit and substandard drug detection. This is raising public awareness and improving the foreign government's capability to identify counterfeit and substandard medicines. While I've focused thus far on a few bilateral efforts, the United States has made the issue of counterfeit and substandard medications a key agenda item in a number of our multilateral institutions. For example, this year, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, or APEC, of which the United States is a host country, had 3 delegations that were focused on counterfeit and substandard medicines. These delegations and the dialogues that were pulled together by APEC have been very important in terms of providing a greater degree of information in the Asia-Pacific region about this important topic. One of the dialogues was a seminar on detection technologies for counterfeit medicines that was held in Beijing, China in September. The location for this seminar was strategic, and it was no accident that we wanted to hold it in China, which leads me to the second topic I want to discuss in some detail, and that is the large and growing problem of China in this area. Over 80% of the active ingredients for drugs sold in this country are made abroad, and they're mainly made in Chinese facilities. It is obvious that China has to be a major focus of our efforts if our efforts are to be successful. When it comes to China, we need to first improve their regulatory systems and to get them to assume responsibility for their regulatory systems, not just for drugs sold in China, but for drugs that they export to the rest of the world. That's why the US FDA is working with their Chinese counterparts to raise their mandatory good manufacturing practices, or GMP requirements, to meet international standards. We also need to stop diversion of active ingredients into the gray market, that is, the shadowy network of counterfeiters. These are criminals that don't care about a patient's health when selling fake, tainted, poisonous, or substandard forms of what should be, but often are not, life-sustaining medicines. For this, we're using reputation as a major hook. I just returned from a trip to China where I addressed the U.S.-China Pharmaceutical Summit. I had a chance to meet with aspiring biotech innovators, generic drug manufacturers, and Chinese regulators as well. The Chinese want to move up the pharmaceutical value chain. I explained in very clear terms that if they wanted to do this, the Chinese government and Chinese companies must first show leadership. It's essential that they work toward a culture in which problems are not swept under the rug, but rather are openly discussed. Chinese companies need to build solid reputations, which is critical if they are to build consumer confidence in their industry. The people I met while in China want to do this, or at least a large number of them in this industry, the ones that want to export, because they understand that counterfeit, falsified, and substandard medicines are not a hypothetical problem. They undermine the reputation of all Chinese companies if even a few companies produce tainted or counterfeit or substandard drugs. And the results, in fact, can be tragic. I'm sure everyone in this room knows that 81 Americans died from contaminated heparin in the year 2010. There have also been reported deaths in China due to counterfeit and substandard medicines. So this is not just a hypothetical problem. It is a real problem, and it is an enormously important reputational problem for a country that does want to play a greater role in the international pharmaceutical arena. Patient and industry confidence is a key element not only in China, but it is a key problem in many other parts of the world. And this, therefore, is the third topic I want to discuss today. Patient confidence is a theme that we're thinking about globally, particularly given the interconnectedness of pharmaceutical supply chains throughout the world. For most of the 19th century, drugs were neither safe nor effective. One of the leading physicians of that time, the dean of the Harvard Medical School, Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr., famously commented that if all medicines in the world were thrown into the sea, it would be all to the better for mankind and all the worse for the fishes. We cannot afford to return to this era. We must ensure that our citizens, in their most desperate moments, in many cases, have confidence that the medicines they are taking or that their loved ones are taking are safe and are effective. Experts report that there have been a 700% increase in drug counterfeiting from 2002 to 2009. It is not just lifestyle drugs that are being counterfeited. That seemed to be the case several years ago, that the drugs that were counterfeited were primarily lifestyle drugs. That is no longer the case. In 2009, we identified counterfeited versions of over 800 unique medicines, ranging from antibiotics to cardiovascular drugs to anti-cancer therapies. Securing the pharmaceutical supply chain continues to be one of the most difficult obstacles to overcome the battle against counterfeit medicines. Technological solutions in the form of track and trace technologies, detection technologies, and mobile technologies have started to break through some of the obstacles. Such technologies are becoming increasingly available as useful tools for enforcement and for helping regulatory authorities. The private sector will need to show leadership in embracing these technologies to secure their reputations and patient confidence in the pharmaceutical industry. The internet and the growth of online pharmacies, which was discussed in the earlier panel, has also complicated matters substantially. Consumers have a very hard time differentiating between legitimate and illegitimate online pharmacies. Through the efforts of my colleague Victoria Espinel, the White House Intellectual Property Coordinator, the private sector has voluntarily agreed to address rogue online pharmacies responsible for distributing illegal pharmaceuticals in the United States. And several internet and credit card companies have stepped forward to support efforts to educate the public and start taking voluntary enforcement action against illegal internet pharmacies. Actions like these, if they continue and are expanded, can help build consumer confidence. Let me conclude with a few summary thoughts. I began my talk by discussing the issue of collaboration. Because illicit activity on one side of the globe can result in deaths on the other side, for instance, tainted cough syrup in Panama, fake anti-malarials in West Africa, and other such incidents, it is vitally important that we focus our collective attention and resources on this problem and see it for what it is, and that is a global problem which requires global solutions. Governments around the world and companies around the world need to work together to improve the safety of their medicines. I've highlighted a number of examples of where this type of collaboration has already proven to be fruitful. There is also a growing concern about links between counterfeit medicines and criminal groups around the world. Globalization of legitimate business and the movement of goods across borders allow organized criminal networks to take advantage of legitimate transportation channels, weak legal and regulatory frameworks, and inefficient judicial systems to ply their wares. So they're using this global system and the vulnerabilities of this global system to do the kind of things that get around the kinds of regulatory procedures that we have in the United States and that other countries have as well. Criminal enterprises are more nimble in many cases than government bureaucracies, making it difficult to completely shut down an enterprise even when it is discovered, because in many cases, for instance, an online illegal pharmacy can be shut down and then start up somewhere else. Many of them are virtual so that they can go from one place to another wherever they have a regulatory license to do it, or where they can avoid the regulators entirely. They move on and on and on, and the challenge of finding them and shutting them down requires many governments, and it requires a concerted effort. This is why all stakeholders need to collaborate. And governments, no one government, not even the United States government, with the FDA and all of its other regulatory and legal devices, can safeguard medicines on their own. The reputation of the industry is also, of course, on the line. I'm happy to report that we've made some progress over the past few years through the commitment of individuals in this room and other like-minded stakeholders. My challenge to you, however, and to ourselves as a government, is to redouble the efforts, because those people who are pursuing the sale of illicit drugs or substandard drugs or counterfeit drugs are moving very rapidly to try to outdo what we in this room and what our government are trying to do to prevent them from their activities which endanger so many lives. The United States is indeed a willing and eager partner to play a strong leadership role in this process, and the State Department, working with the FDA and other agencies, sees this as a critically important challenge to the global supply chain of pharmaceutical products, and to doing what we are responsible to do and what we must do for our own citizens and for others, and that is protect them against these harmful practices. But we obviously need your help, your resources, your innovative ideas, all together, because the problem of counterfeit and substandard medicines is, as I've mentioned, global and multifaceted. There is no one-size-fits-all solutions. We, that is the governments of the world, the private sectors of many countries, and civil society, also need to push one another to do better. With your help and with our continued efforts, I am confident that if we stay committed, we can achieve the level of pharmaceutical security that all of our citizens depend upon and all of our citizens deserve. And I thank you very much for your attention, and I thank you very much for all that you're doing to make the goal of protecting the patients around the world and the reputation of this industry and the quality of drugs as high as possible. And I think that will benefit all of us, all of you, and the world in general. And I thank you very much.
Time for questions. Yeah. Secretary Horwitz, we'll take some questions. So we'll start right here.
Thank you. Is this on? Yes, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Hormats. Michelle Forsley here. Several commentators over the last few years, including the International Conference of Drug Regulatory Authorities in 2006, I believe it was, and others subsequently, even now, within the working group at the WHO on counterfeit medicines, have called for a convention to combat counterfeit medicines. Some have even phrased it in terms of a convention on crime, the crime of counterfeit drugs. Could you comment on the feasibility or opportunity that such a convention might offer as a solution and as a way to coalesce all of the various actions that governments are taking around the world, and to coordinate their cooperation in a more structured way?
Well, I think that certainly is one option. We hadn't really looked at it in quite that way, although I do think pulling everyone together would certainly raise the visibility of the issue, which would be one way of educating people to the seriousness of the problem. What we've been trying to do is to do this in a more regional fashion, as I mentioned, using APEC, for instance, as an important regional group, since a large portion of the drugs that come into the United States and indeed are circulated around the world originate from East Asia. In fact, China being the main problem, let's face it, it is. And they have to recognize that it is. And we have to continue to help them to understand the implications of this, so that we've been doing it more in a regional fashion. In some countries, there's really not a major issue. But I do think the more we can shed attention or shed light on this, the better it will be. One of the things that I'm hoping we can do over a period of time is get the group of 20, which we're actively involved in, to focus more on this. This wouldn't have every country in the world, but it would certainly have the 20 biggest economies in the world, or at least most of them. So we haven't really thought of something of that nature, but it's certainly a reasonable idea for raising the visibility of this. And I suppose in collaboration with the FDA and the Department of Justice and other agencies, we could do it. You'd have to have a lot of people in that room because, as I said, you have governments, you have the legal authorities, you have civil society, and obviously you have to have the pharmaceutical industry. We did have at the last meeting of the G20 a conference on the internet, and one of the elements of the internet conference was piracy of intellectual property over the internet and the use of the internet for illicit purposes. And you know, we have an interesting challenge in this country. We believe in the freedom of the internet. We believe, and Secretary Clinton has made this point on a regular basis, we believe that the internet should be free, open, democratic. On the other hand, there are laws, and there needs to be a very clear set of rules about illicit items being sold over the internet, particularly items that endanger the lives of people. So we don't see the internet as being a free and open internet as being in conflict with enforcing the laws of the United States and protecting the citizens of the United States against counterfeit drugs or substandard drugs. And we tried to use this conference to a degree to underscore that point. But I do think we should try to find as many vehicles for making these kinds of points as we possibly can, since as the last panel concluded, and I think we have concluded from our conversations, education about this is critical, and making people aware of it is critical. A lot of people, they look at a website. You can look at a website to download a movie, download software. You don't really know, the average consumer just doesn't really know whether it's a legal or an illegal website. And having certifications on the legality or illegality are important, but you have to get people to understand what they are, and maybe doing something like this could give it more visibility.
Undersecretary Hormats, glad to see Lori Garrett from the Council on Foreign Relations. As you know,
You've done some great work on this. I think Council's really had some very good sessions on this very subject, so thank you for that.
we're trying, sir. Yeah. And as you know, I've long felt it had to go to G20 level, but we've had troubles opening that door. I wanted to ask you about decoupling, because as you stressed 3 times in your remarks by my count, this is first and foremost a public health issue. But in much of the rest of the world, U.S. advocacy on this issue is seen as more tightly coupled to IP protection and a willingness to forego public health or use public health as a sort of side excuse in order to get IP protection. How in conversations in places like Brazil, let's put China aside for a moment, Brazil or India or South Africa, can you decouple the issues sufficiently so that the U.S. Priority of public health is a heartfelt one?
Well, you've really raised a very important point. The first time Peggy and I met, when I was just in my job a few weeks, and she had just more or less come on board as well, we had a conversation about this, and it focused just on exactly the point you're raising. I think the issue that we have is that we have a broad intellectual property protection issue in a wide range of areas. And in many cases, it is largely an intellectual property protection issue. In this case, it is more a public health. The more direct threat, the more significant threat to the average person in our own country and elsewhere is the public health issue. And I think the way you do that is to illustrate very clearly the kinds of risks that occur through the widespread use of counterfeit or substandard medicines. I don't think people understand this as much as they should. I think people in this room clearly do, but I don't think that it's fully understood. You get the heparin issue, when you get tainted toothpaste and a whole range of things. There's case after case of counterfeit medicines endangering people's lives or killing people in some cases. So I think that is the way we do it. The goal is to protect not only our citizens, but the citizens of other countries. We don't want to see American citizens die. We don't want to see Chinese citizens die either. And they shouldn't want to see that happen either. So we have to figure out some way of trying to make this case in a far more comprehensive way. And the data really speak for themselves. When you add, I mean, there are a number of things that if they're counterfeited, it's bad because they're counterfeited, and the person who makes them loses because the counterfeiter is making the money and not the producer of the legitimate product. There are very few cases in which the result of that is death. And in counterfeit pharmaceuticals, that can be the result, or serious harm, indeed people who can be ruined for life if they take the wrong kind of drugs or counterfeit drugs. So this is something that we just have to drum into people through education and using the statistics that are available to help them understand this. I think there are people in China who do understand this. I just think that the reference to sweeping things under the rug was not an accidental one. I mean, there is a tendency to say, well, we understand it, but we're really not able or not willing to do anything about it. I think more and more, because they have their own companies, and Chinese have what they call a going out strategy, which is their companies want to sell more and more goods. They need to have a reputation around the world to sell quality, high value added products. And if people die from their products in China or elsewhere, it undermines that. So I do think That's the kind of thing, by utilizing the data more and more to illustrate the risks, we have a better chance of making that decoupling that you've described.
One more question.
Yep.
Hi, I'm Dirk Rogers, rxtrace.com. It's just a blog, harmless. But thank you very much. Thank you very much for this excellent presentation. It's really exciting to know that the State Department has the level of knowledge and understanding and appreciation that you have exhibited. I just wanted to clarify or make sure I get it clear. You'd mentioned the 800 drugs had been identified in the United States as being counterfeit, and then immediately after that you talked about the need for track and trace technologies to protect our supply chain. I just wanted to make sure I understood that those 800 drugs that were identified as being counterfeit were not found in the legitimate supply chain, were they?
No, they were found not to my knowledge. I think they were found in the sort of shadowy supply chain that I was talking about earlier.
Right, more the internet or the, maybe not even internet, but the stuff that's coming in.
But the fact is, the point I was trying to make is we're not talking about just lifestyle drugs. They're talking about, these are drugs, oncological drugs. These are cardiovascular drugs. These are things of that nature. The legitimate drug companies selling goods through legitimate procedures utilize probably the kind of things you're making to keep a good supply of drugs on the shelves of most pharmacies, legitimate pharmacies, and legitimate internet pharmacies. It's just that there's this shadow market. Stuff gets in from all over the world, and that is where that's where the real risk comes from. But the broader point I was trying to make, and the reason I was linking the two is, not linking the two, but discussing the two together, was that there are more and more techniques for identifying legitimate drugs and identifying illegitimate ones or counterfeit ones or ones that are substandard. So the fact is, what we'd like to do is help other countries to get access to the kind of technology which will enable them, because they have to protect their citizens too. I mean, if you get a country in which there are outbreaks of illicit drugs or drugs that cause people to die or to become sick or don't cure them, those governments are held responsible by their people for not properly policing their drug system. So what we would like to do is recognizing that American companies and companies in other parts of the world have new techniques for identifying and identifying these drugs and detecting substandard drugs or drugs that don't do what they're supposed to do. We ought to be trying to help those countries in order to get that technology, both to protect their own citizens and to avoid those drugs coming to the United States or some other place. That was the point I was trying to make. But the FDA will tell you that the normal drug supply through normal legitimate drug chains and even legitimate websites is not normally vulnerable to this. I mean, it's not to say that it couldn't happen, but certainly the numbers that I was indicating don't imply that the legitimate chain of supply is subject to those kinds of irregularities or substandard products, no. Just to reassure you. So thank you very much.